Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me again as I wrap up this series on the Three Sisters. If you saw my last video, you know that I spent the majority of it harvesting dried Hickory King dent corn or field corn. Most of the corn that I've grown in the past, I've simply harvested while it was ripe and fresh. The only times that I've used dried corn has been when I was growing popcorn, which doesn't require all the processing. You just remove it from the cob and pass it through a fan to remove the chaff, and then it's pretty much ready to go. Or any dent corn or sweet corn that I grew that I let dry, I basically either used for seed or for feeding deer. Today though, I'm going to try to go a little bit further. Now, I don't have all the equipment to process the corn that I need, but what I do have is a food processor. And so what I'm going to try to do today is to grind up those corn kernels after I remove them from the cob, and then using a sieve, I will pass a fine sieve through it, which will allow the very fine particles to fall out, which will be used for corn flour. And then the coarser materials will be used for making grits. So I'm excited to try this. It's a brand new experiment for me. So let's get started. After letting the corn dry for 1 to 2 weeks, you now want to remove as many of the silks as possible. Using a brush and brushing along the rows of kernels helps to remove the ones that are down in between. Now we want to start getting the kernels off the cob. It's a little bit trickier with field corn than it is with popcorn, but occasionally you can use a twisting motion, like I'm doing here, to get the kernels off quicker than by just scraping them off with the thumb. On some cobs, the corn comes off easier than others. Like this one, I was able to get a lot off by using the twisting motion. When removing the kernels by hand, there aren't as many silks or debris left behind, but there are some, so it's worthwhile to take a minute to pick out as much of the chaff and silks as possible before moving on to the next step. I left the corn out to dry for an additional 4 days, and so now I'm ready to start processing. As I mentioned earlier, this is very much an experiment, so I'm just going to start by putting the corn into the processor and just pulsing it initially. After trying it a few times, I decided to just leave it on for a minute or so at a time, and then pulsing intermittently as well. And now I'm ready to pass it through a fine sieve. This sieve will allow the very fine particles to drop down, which I will be using for corn flour. And now, just by shaking back and forth, I'll allow the fine flour to fall down into the bowl below. This first step actually worked very well. Now I'm using a sieve with larger holes, which will allow some larger particles to go through, which I will use for cooking grits. This step didn't work as well, because there were either too large of particles to pass through, or the very fine ones had already passed through to become flour. But nonetheless, I was able to get enough to make a half a cup of grits. And so by repeating the steps over and over, grinding and then passing through a fine sieve and then a coarse sieve, I was finally able to get enough to cook some grits. And so here was what I was finished with. This is the flour, which is much finer. And then I had my 1/2 cup that I was using for grits. You can see how much more coarse and large the particles are compared to the flour, especially when you put them side by side. To cook the grits, I put the 1/2 cup that I just processed into a bowl, and then I add 2 cups of water. Then after adding a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, I put it on high flame to bring it to a boil quickly. Stirring it frequently keeps the grits from sticking to the bottom of the pan. Once the water is boiling, the heat is turned down to a simmer and a lid is placed on top, and a timer is set for approximately 20 to 25 minutes. Frequently throughout the cooking, I will still stir it again to keep the grits from sticking to the bottom of the pan. Now that it's ready, I just put it into a bowl, add some butter, and now it's ready to eat. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Processing Corn and Cooking Grits. Until next time. In the past, most of the corn that I've grown, either sweet corn or field corn, I have harvested while it was ripe.